Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few, US PI's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sherry delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and today we're digging into the alarming rise in ADHD diagnosis and the increasing use of prescription stimulants in school-aged children. Joining me today is Dr. David Velkoff, a pioneer in non-drug approaches to treating ADHD. Before I bring him on, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating or a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe to the show. And don't forget to visit uspie.org to learn more and to join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. U.S. PI's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at US PI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and today we're digging into an issue of great interest to me, a growing national crisis that's affecting millions of families, especially those who have boys. I'm talking about the alarming rise in ADHD diagnosis and the increasing use of prescription amphetamines in school-aged children. Joining me today is someone who's spent decades on the front lines of this issue, Dr. David Velkoff. In 1980, Dr. Velkoff co-founded the Drake Institute of Neurophysical Medicine and has been treating patients with biofeedback and neurofeedback longer than any physician in the United States. He also served as the clinical director of an international research study on mind-body medicine, conducted in collaboration with UCLA and the Pasteur Institute. In 1995, he became the founding associate editor of the Journal of Neurotherapy. Dr. David Velkoff, welcome to the podcast.
Sherry, it's my pleasure to be here today with you and your audience.
Well, I so appreciate you taking the time. You've explained to me how long your days are, so I really appreciate you squeezing me into your very long schedule, and I so appreciate the work you do. And you know, of course, because we've had a prior telephone conversation, and I'm just so excited about this interview. So I'm going to start our interview with a question I know that you've been asked before. And I ask you this question because Dr. Laura Schlesinger, who referred me to you, is the first one that alerted me to the idea that children were being medicated with stimulants, or what I like to call them amphetamines. She would say on her radio show back in the 90s when I listened to her, that it was a faux syndrome, she didn't even believe it was a syndrome. She thought that, she would say that what she thought children needed was a good spanking. So I loved her candor and her humor in that. But she was dead serious, and she was the one who convinced me not to medicate my children when my children's school suggested that that's what one of my sons needed. So if you don't mind, can you address that, whether or not ADHD is truly a syndrome, or is it something that perhaps is being fabricated for profits by a pharmaceutical company?
Sherry, it is a real neurophysical syndrome, but it's misdiagnosed, overdiagnosed, underdiagnosed. It's a wastebasket diagnosis that physicians or psychologists will put kids into, and they really don't understand what's going on with the child. And if you do brain imaging studies, if someone truly has ADHD, you'll see that there are what's called networks in the brain that are what we call dysregulated. The problem is that a child could be depressed for appropriate reasons and be misdiagnosed with ADHD. A child could go through episodes of anxiety and be misdiagnosed with ADHD. A child could have a language auditory processing disorder and be misdiagnosed with ADHD. So it is a real syndrome. I love Dr. Laura. She's great. But it is a real syndrome, but it's overdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, misdiagnosed. If a child is speech delayed or has frequent middle ear infections, it can cause auditory processing difficulty. So they're not able to clearly process every letter or word as rapidly as clearly as they're listening to it. So they'll have difficulty with verbal understanding in class. It affects reading. And they're often diagnosed as ADHD and put on amphetamine class drugs. It's wrong. It's terribly wrong. Let's say that I want to learn French and I go in to take a first year French class, but it ends up to be a third year French class. There's no way I'm going to be able to pay attention to that teacher. I'm going to be bored, distracted. I'm just not going to pay attention. It has nothing to do with an intentional problem. I'm not comprehending what a third year French teacher is teaching. So it's not uncommon for kids with language processing difficulty misdiagnosed with ADD and medicated for something that they don't even have.
Well, that's a great example. So let's talk about the number of children diagnosed and consequently medicated with amphetamines as it continues to rise. You know, the research that I've been reading said that it was below 3% when they first started studying it. It rose to 3% in 1993, and now to a record number of 11.4% of children in America are now diagnosed in 2022. So, what would you think is behind that surge? Is this an epidemic, or are these diagnoses being handed out too easily?
I don't have a perfect answer, but I'll give you my answer. First of all, the pharmaceutical industry dominates medical education and training, and they are brilliant at marketing their drugs. And they that's how medical students are trained. It's how interns and medical residents are trained in their postgraduate training. They're trained to use medication. Before I went to medical school, I earned a master's degree in psychology. And then I worked in a mental health center for 3 years counseling kids. Then I went to medical school. I had a very different background than most of my classmates, and I had a different view of how to help patients. And I just knew intuitively drugs were not the only answer. By the way, I'm not against medication blindly at all. There are many medical diseases where medications are life-saving. If I have a bacteria infection, I take antibiotics. So I'm not against drugs, but I'm very concerned about how kids are over-medicated, and we do not have long-term studies on the safety and effectiveness of these drugs. So one is the pharmaceutical industry, they dominate medical education. If I go to a medical conference on treating ADHD, and for it's called continuing medical education credit, you have to do it every 2 years to renew your medical license. It's all going to be on drugs, often sponsored by the drug companies. And it biases your view of the world. It biases your thinking, how to look at disorders. And medical students are trained in a very narrow focus. I graduated Emory Medical School. It's a great medical school. I love in Atlanta. I love my medical school experience. But it was a very narrow perspective, a very narrow focus. Why would I want to put a child on an amphetamine class drug if I have a more effective and safer way of treating it? So number one is pharmaceutical companies dominate it, and they train physicians. And unfortunately, it even infiltrates into the school systems. And teachers begin to believe if a child has trouble paying attention, they need to be medicated. Or if they have trouble sitting still, they should be immediately medicated. And teachers are unfortunately, many of them well-intentioned, fall into the same misinformation, I call it. But there may be more ADHD today than it was years ago. I think that uh, pollution can contribute to it. Mothers during pregnancy are exposed to more toxic pollutants than we ever were 30, 40 years ago. It can affect fetal development. There are a lot of reasons. Also, with advances in medicine, infants that were born very premature, very low birth weight, are more likely to survive today than they were 30, 40 years ago, but their neurodevelopment is going to take some hits on it. And we've treated children with ADHD, Sherry, they weighed 1 pound at birth. They were delivered at 24 weeks. Well, their neural development is going to be affected by that severe immaturity. So I think that breakthroughs in neonatology, helping newborns, saving their life, may increase the risk. And I just think there are a lot of toxins in the environment we never had before.
Well, that makes sense to me, and I appreciate you clearing that up for me. I'm really pleased to learn that because I've always kind of just gone along with the idea that it's made up. I guess I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist. I get called that often. But there are a lot of real conspiracies out there, and I theorize about them. But nonetheless, I agree with you that there could be things in the environment that are also causing children to have problems with their brain development. And certainly drugging them at early ages, especially if it's a misdiagnosis, could ultimately affect that as well. So we know that the test that is used is a checklist. And I think there's two checklists. If you get 6 out of the 10 in 2 environments, then you have it. And so what are the risks? And the other research I've done too, before I ask you the question about the risk, is that there's really no definitive test. Like if you have something like a sugar problem, if you have diabetes, you can take a test and whether you have it or not. So what are the risks of this sort of superficial diagnosis? And are the amphetamines like Ritalin and Adderall a good treatment for this diagnosis?
First of all, Adderall is an amphetamine. It's a very powerful drug. If you have ADHD and you can't focus and you take an amphetamine, of course you're going to focus better because you're on speed. But when the drug wears off, you're going to go through a drug withdrawal and you'll crash later in the evening. It doesn't do anything to fix the problem, and it affects the heart. It can suppress growth rate. You can become dependent on it. It's just, if a child truly has ADHD and nothing can help that child with non-drug treatment, and their self-esteem is in the gutter, I would consider medicating that child as a very last option. If their self-esteem is so damaged, parents are good parenting, loving family, and they can't focus and concentrate, I would consider medicating that child, but that's a very small percent, and it's very down the road. So you always want to look at non-drug options first, and just filling out a checklist is not an evaluation. A checklist just shows you what symptoms you're having. Sherry, I could have 10 children the same age, same symptoms, and let's say they really each have ADHD. Every one of their brain maps are different, are very different, and their treatment is individualized, what we see on the brain. I want to add one more thing. Let's not leave out food additives, food, artificial colorings and flavorings. They will destabilize the brain, and they can cause behavioral issues or concentration issues. In some of the European countries, they now have warning labels on foods with artificial flavorings and colorings. Those are other factors. So there are many variables. If I want to explain this to you, your brain has in it about 100 billion neurons, brain cells, and they work in different frequencies. We record from 1 to 34 hertz. It's how many times a neuron fires per second, because that's where most of the brain's energy is, from 1 to 34 cycles per second. When the neurons are firing 1 to 12 hertz, they're firing very slow. They're under functioning. It has nothing to do with intelligence. It's kind of like your car engine when the idling is turned down too low. During the day, you want the brain operating at 12 to 18 hertz. Everything is activated fully, you're calm and you're focused. If your brain's at 20 to 30 hertz, it's overactivated, like a muscle in spasm. So a brain mapping can identify, are the neurons working normally or not? If the brain map comes out relatively normal, this child's attentional symptoms are not due to a neurophysical problem. There's something else going on in the child's life. Maybe you have parents that are very judgmental, overly critical, never praise the child. Maybe the child suffered some kind of trauma that the parents are not aware of that causes their brain to shut down. There are many other variables. So you want to look at the brain. For brain map is normal. We're not dealing with ADHD.
Well, that's very interesting, and I believe that one of the things that I've read and researched too, as far as the symptoms that are on that checklist, I think are fairly common in children and especially in boys. I happen to have raised 4 boys, and I know firsthand that boys are very hyper. They don't like to sit still. They lose things. They don't pay attention. Some of the things that are on the list for ADHD, and I'm sure that's why one of my boys was diagnosed with that. But I refused to medicate him, and we got through some tough years in schooling, but we got through it, and he went on to college. So the recent reports say that 1 in 4 boys are diagnosed with ADHD. So why do you think boys are disproportionately diagnosed? And is this a case of normal childhood energy, or is it something else?
I'm happy to answer that. The symptoms of ADHD are symptoms of normal childhood behavior and development. Every child, Sherry, is going to have moments of inattentiveness, forgetfulness. Some children have moments of hyperactivity, impulsivity. It's only a problem if it occurs much more frequently than is expected for that child's age, and it disrupts their life, where they're underachieving academically to their potential. They have impulse control problems they really can't control. They have behavioral issues. They're coming from a very stable, healthy family dynamics, and their hyperactivity or impulsivity is excessive for a child that age. And it's got to disrupt their life. If it's not causing academic difficulty, not causing behavioral, social difficulty in their life, their self-esteem is intact, it's most likely not a disorder. You know, in fairness, though, to kids with ADHD, the right frontal part of the brain, it filters and inhibits your impulses. So when the child gets an impulse, it's quickly filtered and inhibited and put on hold for a few moments so the child has time to think. If the right frontal part of the brain is not fully activated, when a child gets an impulse, it's not filtered or inhibited, they will express the impulse spontaneously. And they're really behaving normally for their brain, but their brain is not filtering their impulses. So when they get criticized, their self-esteem gets very damaged, and they start to believe and feel that they're living in an unfair world. The world's against them. They didn't do anything wrong. I'll ask a true ADHD child who's very impulsive. I said, why do you do that? And they'll say, I don't know. And they really don't know. It was just an impulse, but their brain's not filtering. So there is real ADHD. And then there's overdiagnosis of ADHD, where the clinician doing the diagnosis has a very limited understanding of the disorder, or doesn't look at brain functioning. You know, psychiatry is the only specialty in medicine that doesn't study the organ that it's treating. If I go into the ER and I have chest pain, first thing they're going to do is an electrocardiogram of my heart, an EKG of my heart. So if you've got significant symptoms, behavioral symptoms that are disrupting your life or causing you to underachieve, it's common sense. Let's look at how the brain's working. Psychiatry doesn't do that. If they did that, less kids would get diagnosed with ADHD.
Yeah, and I believe you shared with me that that's why your perspective is so unique, because you have training in both areas, and most medical doctors don't have the background in psychiatry, and so that brings a lot to the table, and helped form your perception and the need for the specific type of treatment. Is that right?
Yes, you want to look comprehensively at the child. What is their diet like? What is their sleep like? If they're playing video games all night, they're going to have attentional symptoms the next day. If they're on excessive screen time with video games, they're eating junk food. They get very poor sleep because they stay up. They when their parents go to sleep, they take out their cell phones and play video games till 3 o'clock in the morning. They're going to have behavioral issues next day in school.
Hmm. And I'm sure a lot of that is happening. Screen time is a whole nother issue. So we need to take a short break right now. But when I get back, I'd like to get your thoughts on the report from the Trump administration's Make America Healthy Again Commission. I'll be back with my interview with Dr. David Velkoff right after this. Government schools do not like boys. Boys are just too active, so they need to be medicated. Boys have budding, quote-unquote, toxic masculinity, so they must be belittled with narratives of being oppressors. Simply put, boys are being punished just for being boys. Young American men are in crisis. Research shows that poor school experiences are strongly linked to major challenges later in life, including physical and mental health issues, addiction, and crime. Today, fewer young adult men are settled into permanent jobs, and fewer men are married with children. With men in positions of authority dressed as women, role models have become confusing at best. U.S. Parents Involved in Education is sounding the alarm. Save our boys. Save our country. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education and connect with us at USPI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today is Dr. David Velkoff of the Drake Institute of Neurophysical Medicine. I want to ask you about the White House's recent Make Our Children Healthy Again report, which warns that the only long-term trial found only short-term behavior benefits of 14 months, which were not found 3 years later. So it says that at 3, 5, 8, and 14 years, no benefits were seen in grades, relationships, achievement, behavior, or any other measure. So in other words, prescribing amphetamines to children does nothing in the long run to reduce ADHD symptoms, and more importantly, has never been shown to improve academic achievement. So what is your reaction to these findings after nearly 4 decades of children being prescribed amphetamines?
Sherry, I'm not surprised at all that they came up with those findings. It doesn't surprise me at all. I've been clinically saying that for decades, The drug wears off, nothing will have changed. I could take one of these stimulant drugs tonight at midnight and stay up all night and read a month of medical journals and think, oh, I'm so gifted, look what I can do. I'll pay the price tomorrow. So if a kid has attentional problems, you put them on a stimulant drug, of course they're going to focus better till the drug wears off. Then they regress, and then they build up a tolerance to the dosage. So these kids that had no improvement after being on drugs for 5 or 6 years, there's a high risk if they're shorter than they would have been had they not taken drugs. There's a risk of that. I've seen it happen. I've had kids come to us. They've been on similar drugs for 6, 7, 8 years. Their growth is permanently stunted from that. So I do agree with the findings.
So that's a good segue into my next question, which is, we know that amphetamines like Ritalin and Adderall, I think Adderall is the most common now, they're highly addictive. As you said, they're speed. And so there are other health issues that can manifest in children who regularly take these drugs. So you've mentioned the stunning growth, which, is from the research I've read, is a proven fact that it does stunt growth in children. Are there other, there has to be, obviously, but if you'll explain what the other side effects of these drugs and the potential health risk are to children that take them for a long period of time.
Well, it can raise your blood pressure. It can elevate your heart rate. It may affect the liver. It suppresses your appetite, so you're not getting good nutrition during the day. When your brain is developing and growing and needs optimal nutrition, your nutrition can be compromised during the day because you're not eating. And then when the drug wears off, you're going to have a rebound, severe appetite and overeat. And we just don't know what the long-term effects are of brain development. If someone takes these stimulant drugs for 5 years in childhood, and when they're 45 years old, they go in the ER and they're having a heart attack, we don't know if having taken those amphetamines when they were kids predisposed them to heart disease. It's an unanswered study question. So we really don't know. It's just common sense. You don't want to be on amphetamines chronically unless there's no other alternative. And when you're dealing with children, you want to take a very conservative bias. You want to err on the side of safety.
Yes.
My other
Yes.
concern is it's not teaching the neurons in the brain how to work normally. It's not teaching them how to work normally. You know, I've committed so much of my adult life's work to what's called neurofeedback, where children, even adults with ADD, they can train their brain to work at an optimal brainwave frequency for peak performance. And you can teach your brain that. You do it over and over. That's the way the brain begins to work. We're treating children today. We treated their parents 25 years ago for ADD. So there can be a genetic factor, and their parents now have normal, successful lives, but genetically their children have it. So we know our treatment has long-term improvement. And I will say, in fairness, there are kids that have to be medicated sometimes, but it's a much, much smaller percent than we ever realized. And medical students, when they go through medical education, they're exposed to a very limited viewpoint of how to treat disease. There was my other frustration is that many physicians that I speak to, they have no scientific curiosity in what we do. They're not interested. They just give drugs. Back in the last half of the 19th century, people were dying after surgery from infections because there was no antiseptic solutions or techniques in surgery. And Joseph Lister, a very famous physician at University of Edinburgh Medical School, I think in Scotland, he did an experiment, and he used an antiseptic solution on patients' skin before and after the surgery. And guess what? There was a very little infection rate or death rate from it. And it opened up the whole world of antiseptic techniques. He was ridiculed and mocked by physicians all over the United States. He came to this country and he was verbally attacked. Well, today, it would be gross malpractice not to use antiseptic techniques. So when new ideas are emerged, the existing status quo resists them. It's unfortunate. I'm just disappointed that many of my colleagues have no interest in what we do. They're not curious. As a scientist, you should be curious. If I discover something that's more effective than neurofeedback, it's safe and effective, Sherry, I'll use it tomorrow.
Right. Especially, balanced with the idea that the amphetamines are harming children. I mean, you would think a doctor would want to do no harm, I think is what they profess to do.
They're told it's safe. It's safe. They're told it's safe. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but some of the scientific studies I don't trust because they could be biased. There's studies that they can do that they throw out when they don't like the results. Many years ago, I did, I'm not going to say his name, but I debated a nationally proponent of drugs for ADHD. And we debated on national television. And I thought, I bet you he's got to be paid by the drug companies. Got to be. Why would he take a stand like this and not be scientifically curious about our treatment? Well, years later, I found out he was paid by 3 different pharmaceutical companies.
And that doesn't surprise me a bit. And the study bias that you have alluded to is also something that is in the Maha report that RFK Jr. led. So he discusses many of the things that you're talking about: the screen time for children, the dyes in foods, diet and nutrition, the study bias, and something he calls corporate capture is what he calls what's happening with the pharmaceutical companies and their influence on the studies, the bias in the studies. I think I read that they're commissioned by the government billions of dollars to do these studies for their own drugs. There's certainly some conflicts there. And so I'm real impressed with RFK Jr. I've followed his work. I read his book about Dr. Fauci, and my daughter-in-law, who's homeschooling my grandchildren, doesn't vaccinate her children at all. the oldest child, I think, had one or two vaccines early on, but the second child has had none. We're just very skeptical of the pharmaceutical companies and the drugs that they're putting into young children and the effects that they have on them long term. So I'm really excited about RFK Jr.'s work. If you had his ear, what would you recommend as a strategy for the government to end the medical practice of prescribing amphetamines to children?
I would look at uh, fund non-drug treatment options and look at the effectiveness of, for example, brain map guided neurofeedback. Look at the effectiveness of it. And it should be taught in medical schools. I might add, as a caveat to what you said, if you see these studies when they say all the drugs are so effective, this and that, at the end of the study, look at who funded the study. And then look at the doctors or psychologists that did the study, and they have to report any potential conflict of interest. And you'll find that often they are paid consultants to the pharmaceutical industry. So it's so biased. The government should fund the kind of research that we did. I'm not going to say their name, but there are two major medical schools in Southern California that I tried to get them for years to collaborate with us and do a study. They publish studies all the time on the drugs. And I said, do a study with us. I said, if you really believe our treatment is not effective, I open my doors to you. Come in and measure the results. And if you discover it's not effective, announce it to the world scientifically, but you know that it works. And the doors are open for you to come in and measure it. Sherry, they never came in. I just get tired. I don't deal with them anymore. I just want to help more and more children. We have new clinical technology that we're going to be implementing in the next 4 weeks that is so exciting, so cutting edge, where even the most severe kids can improve their brain functioning without drugs.
Well, that's wonderful. That is great news. And I'm with you on that as far as being frustrated with their lack of concern or interest in doing what's best for children. But I do think we are at a time when people may be paying attention, and maybe it has something to do with RFK Jr.'s commission and the things that they're exposing. Maybe they're trying to cover themselves, but when New York Times Magazine comes out with an article titled, "Maybe We've Been Looking at ADHD All Wrong," and then points to all the studies that shared some of the things I shared earlier, I think that people are going to start waking up. And that's why I'm so excited that you're willing to do this interview, because I've actually been looking and searching for a doctor that would be willing to talk about this, that would tell us the truth. So again, I'm just very excited to have you on this interview. And I was going to move into a short break, but before I do that, I made a few notes, and I just want to share my personal experience with the viewers and with you about what you call speed. And that was the street name it was called when I was a teenager and drugs were so popular in the early 70s. And I have an adult son who unfortunately has suffered from addiction to methamphetamine for most of his adult life. And I have seen the ravaging effects of that drug. So when you talk about they stay up all night and it's hard on their body because, sometimes they'll go 4 or 5 days without sleep, and then they crash and burn, and nutrition, of course, they lose a lot of weight. So they're not getting any nutrition because it suppresses their appetite. And it is highly addictive. I've seen my son go through rehab after rehab, and it's devastating. And that's another reason it's very personal to me, that I'm infuriated, quite frankly, that we are drugging so many children with this drug that can be so devastating. But it is a sad situation. I appreciate you allowing me to share that. But that's, again, why I take this so personally, and I know what it does to a person's life. And I've seen it in adults too. I have a relative who's taken Adderall for more than 25 years, and his life is in shambles. So he's taking speed during the day and then something to calm him down to sleep at night. And his doctor has prescribed this for, like I said, over 25 years. And his life is just a mess.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So before we go to break, I'd like to ask you an important question, one that I think my viewers would be very interested in, and that's, what does the Drake Institute do in contrast to what the mainstream medical community does to treat children who are diagnosed with ADHD?
We look at the brain. We look at how the brain is functioning. We do what's called quantitative EEG brain mapping to see if any areas of the brain are not working optimally that are causing symptoms. And we also look, Sherry, at the connectivity of the brain. All these billions of neurons in your brain, they work together, they share their information. So your brain is using information from multiple networks to carry out very complex tasks. You'll find with ADHD, even more so with autism, that these networks are not communicating, they're not connecting, they're not talking, they're not sharing their information. You can train the brain to improve connectivity of the brain. We do that all the time. And they've even done MRI studies and shown that when you do neurofeedback effectively, you literally increase the size and volume of the brain. The brain literally gets bigger, larger, because you're increasing the size and numbers of the connections of the brain. So we do brain mapping first. Brain mapping's normal. You're not dealing with neurologic ADHD. Look at screen time, look at diet, look at sleep patterns, look at parenting, and you'll get answers.
Okay, very comprehensive approach, in contrast to the 10-item checklist.
Oh, please. When I have patients come to me and the mother says, the doctor interviewed me for 15 minutes and gave me a prescription for a stimulant drug. After a 15-minute interview, gave me a prescription for a stimulant drug.
Yes, and it's a shame that that's happening, and I'm really hoping that interviews like this and other things that I'm hoping to do in the future can really shed the light on the truth in this matter, because we actually, even now, what you've said, you've got children that were medicated all their life, and now they're adults, and these adults are continuing to take the drugs, in throughout their life. And
Or they may end up in the many rehab centers are full of people, adults with childhood history of ADHD.
Wow, isn't that something? I'm not surprised. So we need to take another short break, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you 2 questions I ask all my guests before closing the show. Don't go away. I'll be right back with my interview with Dr. David Velkoff right after this. Critical race theory sorts people into race-based groups, and government schools are teaching children that people of color are the oppressed and white people are the oppressors. In other words, individuals must be judged based on the color of their skin. In United States Parents Involved in Education's film, Truth and Lies in American Education, Dr. Carol Swain explains that Martin Luther King's dream was that we would be judged by the content of our character rather than the color of our skin. The consequences of judging people this way, Dr. Swain explains, is that as Americans, we lose the basis of unity as members of one human race. Dr. Martin Luther King's vision was for us all to come together. We were brothers and sisters, but according to critical race theory, we can never come together as one. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education, and connect with us at USPI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today has been Dr. David Velkoff of the Drake Institute of Neurophysical Medicine. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has probably been one of the most important conversations I've had on this podcast so far. But before we close, I'd like to ask you 2 questions I ask all of my guests. What are some of your biggest concerns, and what gives you hope?
Biggest concern is that the pharmaceutical industry overdominates medical education and training. And medical students and physicians in training get a very limited viewpoint about how to treat patients. The hope I have is that in the field of medicine that I've helped pioneer clinically, new clinical technology gives us resources to help patients use their own brain's resources for improving itself. So our clinical technology has opened up so many doors. We help people today, Sherry, we couldn't have helped 2 years ago. from advances in clinical technology. If somebody's born 3 months premature, they're going to be at a very high risk for developing attentional learning problems when they get older. Or if there was severe fetal distress during labor and delivery, the brain suffers hypoxia, very increased risk this child's going to have difficulty when they're in elementary school. So we have technology today to help these children that we didn't have years ago.
That's wonderful news. That gives me hope. I appreciate you sharing that. And I thank you so much for this incredible work that you're doing. And you're bringing healing and clarity to families who are navigating ADHD. What resources would you recommend, and how can they find out more about your work?
Well, we're in Southern California. It's called the Drake Institute of Neurophysical Medicine. The phone number is 310-208-2020. They can reach out to us. The website is drakeinstitute.com. That would be probably the best way. We do treat remotely, but you have to live in California to be treated remotely. We have patients come to us from all over the United States who we treat.
Well, that's wonderful. It's a great resource for parents. And I know that I'm prayerful that this podcast will reach many parents and others will share it so that many more can learn the truth about this issue that's so important. So thanks again for being on the podcast. Thanks to those of you listening and supporting our work. And if you're finding this podcast helpful, please share it with a friend. Join me next week for another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, U.S. PIE seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional U.S. PIE chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapters section.